A millionaire returned to his manor, utterly exhausted, and what he found in the drawing room left him paralyzed. His daughter, who hadn't smiled in 2 years, was dancing with the housekeeper's son. What he would discover later would utterly destroy him. Robert Caldwell pushed open the grand front door of his manor, burdened by the weight of a man carrying the entire world on his shoulders. It had been an interminable day at the offices of the Golden Peaks Hotel Group, and all he wanted was to reach his room, kick off his shoes, and disappear from the world for a few hours. But barely 3 steps inside his own home, his legs ceased to respond. From the grand drawing room, a sound reached him that froze his entire body, as if his feet had been nailed to the marble floor. It was a laugh, a childish laugh, clear, uninhibited, a laugh Robert Caldwell hadn't heard in so long. He had almost forgotten what it sounded like. It was his daughter Isabella's laugh. He approached slowly, holding his breath, as if fearing that any noise might shatter that impossible moment. And when he finally peered into the drawing room, what he saw left him speechless, breathless, unable to process what his own eyes were showing him. In the middle of the manor's most elegant room, seated on the floor with an old guitar resting on her knees, was Victoria Harding, the domestic help his mother had hired just weeks ago. Her fingers moved across the strings with a mastery that did not correspond to a woman who cleaned floors for a living. The melody that flowed from that guitar was soft, enveloping, like an invisible caress that filled every corner of the room. What shattered his heart was seeing Isabella, his little Isabella, dancing. His daughter, that child, who had uttered little more than monosyllables since her mother's death, was holding hands with a boy Robert had never seen before. They spun clumsily, as only children know how, with that imperfect grace more beautiful than any professional choreography. Isabella laughed with her mouth open, her eyes sparkling, her whole body vibrating with a joy that seemed to have been locked away for centuries, waiting for the exact moment to explode. Robert had to steady himself against the doorframe because his legs were trembling. His vision blurred, and he felt something warm trace down his cheeks. He was crying. A man who managed a hotel empire, who negotiated multi-million-pound deals without batting an eyelid, was silently weeping at the entrance to his own drawing room because his daughter was doing something as simple as laughing. "Who are you?" he wanted to ask the boy dancing with Isabella. "What is going on here?" He wanted to demand from the housekeeper who played the guitar, as if she were a Royal Academy artist. But the words wouldn't come out. He stood there, motionless, observing a scene that seemed plucked from another universe, from a reality where his daughter was not broken by pain. The boy dancing with Isabella must have been only a little older than her. He moved with that overflowing energy of childhood, guiding Isabella with surprising tenderness, twirling her carefully, as if instinctively knowing she was fragile and needed to be treated with delicacy. "Again, again," Isabella exclaimed in a voice Robert almost didn't recognize because it had been so long since he heard her speak with enthusiasm. Victoria smiled and began to play a new melody, something faster this time, and the 2 children burst into laughter as they tried to follow the rhythm with their little feet. It was then that the boy noticed Robert's presence at the door. He stopped immediately, and his expression changed from joy to fear in a fraction of a second. He let go of Isabella's hands and backed away several steps, casting his gaze to the floor as if he had done something terrible. "Mummy," the boy whispered in a trembling voice, tugging at Victoria's sleeve. Victoria looked up, and her eyes met Robert's. The guitar stopped abruptly, as if someone had suddenly cut the electricity. A look of absolute terror appeared on Victoria's face, the kind that only surfaces when you know everything you've built is about to collapse. "Mr. Caldwell," Victoria said, standing up so quickly that the guitar almost fell. "I can explain. I know I shouldn't have brought my son. The person who looks after him had an emergency, and I had no one else. And I swear this won't happen again." "Who is that child?" Robert interrupted. But his voice didn't sound as he expected. It didn't sound like the voice of an annoyed boss. It sounded like the voice of a man who had just witnessed a miracle and needed someone to confirm he hadn't dreamt it. "He's my son, sir. His name is Tom. I apologize profusely. It will never happen again. Please, don't dismiss me. This job is all I have." Isabella was laughing. The phrase left Robert's mouth like a sacred whisper, and Victoria fell silent, unsure how to interpret those 3 words. "My daughter was laughing," Robert repeated, and this time his voice broke in a way that made even little Tom lift his gaze from the floor to observe this tall man openly weeping in the doorway of his own drawing room. "Daddy," Isabella said, approaching Robert with that naturalness only children possess, tugging at his hand to pull him towards the center of the room. "Tom is my friend, and Victoria plays the guitar beautifully. Do you want to dance with us? Robert knelt before his daughter, taking her by the shoulders with trembling hands. He looked into her eyes and saw something he had stopped searching for. Life. There was life in those eyes that had been empty, dim for so long, like windows of an abandoned house. And that life had returned not because of expensive therapists, not because of imported toys, not because of trips to international theme parks. It had returned because of an old guitar, a domestic helper, and a boy who had taught her to dance. Since when? How long have you been doing this? Robert asked, turning to Victoria while wiping away tears with the back of his hand. Victoria swallowed, visibly terrified that her answer might cost her job. It wasn't planned, sir. The first time I brought Tom because I had no one to leave him with. Isabella was sitting alone on the stairs. My son approached and offered to play. She didn't respond, but he persisted. And when I started playing the guitar while cleaning, Isabella simply stood up and began to move to the music. And no one told me anything. Victoria's silence was more eloquent than any answer. Before Robert could process all the information, a sharp voice cut the air from the hallway like a knife tearing silk. What is all this commotion? Lady Eleanor Caldwell appeared at the entrance to the drawing room. With that upright posture and implacable gaze she had perfected over decades of ruling that house, as if it were her own kingdom. Her eyes swept over the scene with lightning speed. The housekeeper with a guitar, an unknown child in her drawing room, her granddaughter holding hands with that child, and her son kneeling on the floor with tears in his eyes. Robert, can you explain why there is a strange child in my house? Playing with Isabella, Lady Eleanor asked with a calm that was more menacing than any shout. Grandma, he's my friend, Isabella said with a firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including Robert. Lady Eleanor looked at her granddaughter as if the child had uttered a forbidden word. Then she directed her gaze towards Victoria, and what was reflected in her eyes made Tom instinctively hide behind his mother. Mrs. Harding, Lady Eleanor said in that tone she used to remind everyone in that house of their exact place in the hierarchy. You were hired to clean, not to organize children's parties in the main drawing room, and certainly not to bring your children into a house that is not theirs. Mother, Robert intervened, slowly standing up. Isabella was laughing. Do you understand what that means? I understand that my granddaughter needs appropriate company. Not that of Lady Eleanor stopped before completing the sentence. But the damage was already done. Everyone in the room understood perfectly what she was about to say. Little Tom, from behind his mother's back, looked up and said something that left the entire room in a sepulchral silence. Madam, I just wanted to play with Isa because she's always very sad. My mum says that when someone is sad, you take their hand and don't let go until they smile again. Lady Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, someone had left her speechless, and that someone was a child who barely reached her waist. This conversation is not over, Lady Eleanor finally said, addressing Victoria specifically with a look that was a silent sentence. Tomorrow, first thing, we will discuss the conditions of your employment in this house. And then she withdrew, leaving behind a heavy silence that no one dared to break. Robert looked at Victoria, whose eyes were red-rimmed, and who embraced her son against her chest as if she feared someone would tear him away. Then he looked at Isabella, who had again taken Tom's hand with that silent determination of children who find something valuable and refuse to let it go. Victoria, Robert said in a voice that tried to convey a calm he didn't feel. Don't worry about what my mother said. No one is going to dismiss you. But, sir, no one, Robert repeated firmly. What you and your son did for my daughter tonight, there is no salary in the world that can pay for that. Victoria nodded silently, but Robert could see in her eyes that she didn't entirely believe him, and he couldn't blame her because he knew his mother wouldn't leave things like this. Lady Eleanor Caldwell never left things like that. That night, after Victoria left with Tom, Robert did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sat by Isabella's bed to tuck her in, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, his daughter looked at him with a smile before closing her eyes. Daddy, Isabella whispered, already half asleep. Can Tom come tomorrow too? Robert felt his heart constrict in his chest. We'll see, my love. He told me his daddy is also in heaven, like Mummy, Isabella murmured, and with that devastating phrase, she fell, sound asleep. Robert remained motionless beside his daughter's bed for several minutes, processing those words. Tom had also lost his father. Two children broken by the same wound had met in the drawing room of a manor, and without therapists, without diagnoses, without medications, they had healed each other with something as primitive and powerful as holding hands and dancing. But while Robert processed that discovery, in another corner of the manor, Lady Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved for special occasions. "Penelope," she said in an icy voice, "I need you to come early tomorrow. We have a problem to solve before it gets out of control." On the other end of the line, Penelope Shaw smiled in a way no one would want to see in the dark. "Count on me, Lady Eleanor. That's what I'm here for." What neither of them knew was that this call would unleash a chain of events that would shake the foundations of that manor and expose secrets that had been buried for years under layers of appearances, lies, and complicit silence that was about to shatter in the most devastating way possible. The next morning, Robert woke with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't anxiety, it wasn't worry, it was curiosity. A deep curiosity that gnawed at him from within, like a flame someone had lit the night before that refused to be extinguished. Who was Victoria Harding, really? That question stayed with him as he dressed, as he went downstairs, as he drank his coffee in the main dining room of the manor. A woman who cleaned floors did not play the guitar like that. Victoria's fingers had moved over the strings with the fluidity of someone who had dedicated years, perhaps decades, to mastering that instrument. There was something in her story that didn't fit, a missing piece of the puzzle. And Robert Caldwell was a man who couldn't live with incomplete puzzles. But before he could organize his thoughts, Penelope Shaw was already seated in the dining room with a cup of tea in her hands and a smile that seemed practiced in front of a mirror. "Good morning, Robert," Penelope said with that familiarity she had afforded herself since Lady Eleanor appointed her house manager. "Your mother told me what happened last night. It must have been very uncomfortable for you to encounter that situation." Robert looked at her over his coffee cup. "Uncomfortable?" "My daughter laughed for the first time in years. Penelope, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the best thing that has happened to me in a long time." Of course, Penelope replied quickly, adjusting her tone like someone changing channels. "What I mean is, I understand the emotion of the moment, but your mother is right to worry. We know nothing about that woman or her son, and allowing an unknown child free access to Isabella in her delicate emotional state. Tom is not a danger to my daughter," Robert interrupted with a firmness that surprised even himself. "No one says he is," Penelope replied, softening her voice like a snake caressing before biting. "I'm just saying it would be prudent to investigate a little, to know who that woman is before opening the doors of your house and your family to her." Robert remained silent, and although it annoyed him to admit it, a part of him recognized that Penelope had a point, not out of distrust towards Victoria, but because he needed to understand how a woman with such musical talent had ended up cleaning other people's mansions. That same morning, Robert made a decision. Instead of going directly to the Golden Peaks offices, he asked his personal assistant, a discreet and efficient man named George Miller, to investigate Victoria Harding's background. He didn't want an invasive or police investigation. He just wanted to understand her story. Meanwhile, in the service kitchen, Victoria prepared the cleaning materials with trembling hands. She hadn't slept all night. Lady Eleanor's words kept swirling in her head like a tornado, threatening to sweep away the little she had managed to build. This job was her only sustenance, the only barrier between her and the street, between Tom and hunger. "Mummy, are you all right?" Tom asked, sitting in a corner of the kitchen with an old notebook where he drew, waiting for his mother to finish her first tasks before dropping him off at the local community school. "I'm fine, my love," Victoria lied. With that ability, mothers develop to disguise fear with smiles. "I'm just a little tired. The lady from yesterday is angry because I played with Isa?" Tom asked without looking up from his drawing, with that brutal perception children have who have learned to read the atmosphere to survive. Victoria knelt beside her son and stroked his head. "Don't worry about that, Tom. You didn't do anything wrong. Playing with someone who is sad is one of the kindest things a person can do." "My daddy used to tell me that," Tom replied naturally, as if mentioning the weather. "He said music and friendship heal everything." Victoria had to hold back so her son wouldn't see her cry. The mention of her husband always opened a wound that never quite closed. But before she could answer, the kitchen door opened, and someone Victoria didn't expect to see so early appeared. Robert Caldwell stood in the doorway of the service kitchen, a place he probably hadn't entered in years. His presence there was so unusual that even the cook, Mrs. Higgins, dropped the wooden spoon she was holding. "Victoria, can we speak for a moment?" Robert asked in a tone that tried to be casual but betrayed nervousness. Victoria stood up immediately, smoothing her clothes with her hands in an involuntary gesture. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell, in the library if you don't mind, and you can bring Tom if you wish." Victoria and Tom followed Robert through the manor's corridors to the library, a huge room, full of shelves reaching the ceiling that smelled of old wood and forgotten pages. Tom looked at everything with wide eyes, as if he had entered a fairy tale castle. "Victoria," Robert began, sitting opposite her with a mahogany table between them. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer me honestly." Victoria nodded, squeezing Tom's hand under the table. "Where did you learn to play the guitar like that?" Of all the questions Victoria had imagined, that was the one she least expected, and the one she most feared. Her face changed expression, as if someone had opened a door she had been trying to keep locked for years. "That was in another life, Mr. Caldwell," Victoria replied in a low voice. "A life that no longer exists." "I'd like to know about that life," Robert insisted softly. "Not as your employer, but as the father of a girl who smiled last night thanks to you." Victoria remained silent for a long moment. Tom looked at her with eyes that knew parts of the story, but not all. Finally, Victoria took a deep breath and began to speak. "I studied music from a very young age. My father was a carpenter, but he loved the guitar more than anything in the world. He taught me my first chords before I could read. When I grew up, I won a scholarship to study at the Royal Academy of Music. I was the first person in my family to attend a university." Robert listened without interrupting, fascinated by every word. "During my years at the academy, they told me I had something special. Not just technique, but something that cannot be taught. I was selected to represent the country at an international classical music festival. It was my chance to change my life, my family's life, to prove that a carpenter's daughter could go as far as her talent allowed." "And what happened?" Robert asked, because the pain in Victoria's eyes made it clear that the story did not have a happy ending. "I met Samuel," Victoria said, and as she pronounced that name, her voice transformed into something softer, more vulnerable, as if the name itself were an ancient melody. "He was a luthier. He made handmade instruments. We met because he built the guitar I was going to play at the festival. We fell in love before the guitar was finished." Tom looked up. "My daddy," he whispered with a sad smile, "that no child should know how to draw." "Yes, my love, your daddy," Victoria confirmed, stroking her son's head. "We got married shortly after the festival. I continued playing. He continued making guitars. We were happy. We didn't have much money, but we had music, and for us, that was enough." "And the guitar you were playing last night?" Robert asked, beginning to connect the pieces. "It was the last guitar Samuel built," Victoria replied, and her voice finally broke. "He finished it weeks before the accident. That day he left early for the workshop like any other. I never imagined it would be the last time I would see him alive. When they called to tell me the roof had collapsed, I felt the world split in two. Samuel didn't make it out in time, and with him, everything went. I couldn't play again for months. Every time I picked up the guitar, I felt his presence so strongly that I couldn't breathe. I left the academy, I left music, I left everything. All I had left was Tom and the promise I made to Samuel that our son would never go hungry." "That's why you started working in cleaning," Robert said, not as a question, but as a comprehension that struck him in the chest. "No one hires a guitarist to pay the household bills, Mr. Caldwell, but every house needs someone to clean it. So I put Samuel's guitar in its case and learned to use a broom. And every night, when Tom fell asleep, I would take out the guitar and play in silence, just to feel that he was still near." Robert had to look away because his eyes had filled with tears he didn't want to show. Victoria's story had opened a wound he also carried, that of a man who had lost the woman he loved and didn't know how to move on. "Every day after school, he comes here. He plays with Isabella. You play the guitar. You do what you did last night. Every day. Mr. Caldwell, your mother, my mother, I'll handle." Robert read George Miller's message 3 times before picking up the phone to call him. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number, and every second that passed without an answer felt like an eternity. When George finally answered, his voice had that grave tone he only used when the news was serious. "Sir, what I found is not something I can tell you over the phone. Can you receive me at the manor?" "Come right now," Robert replied and hung up, feeling a knot form in his stomach. While waiting for George, Robert went down to find Victoria to deal with something that could no longer be postponed. Lady Eleanor had announced the previous night that she would speak with Victoria first thing, and Robert needed to get there before his mother to protect the employee from whatever she was planning. But when he reached the main hall, it was already too late. Lady Eleanor stood in front of Victoria, who kept her head bowed while holding a cleaning rag in her hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. A few meters away, Penelope Shaw watched the scene leaning against the wall, arms crossed. With an expression of satisfaction she tried, unsuccessfully, to disguise. "I will explain this only once, Mrs. Harding, Lady Eleanor was saying in that voice that seemed made of polished ice. This house has rules that existed long before you arrived, and that will continue to exist long after you leave. Employees do not mix their personal lives with their work. Employees' children do not play with the owner's children. And no one, absolutely no one, plays musical instruments in the main drawing room as if this were a common tavern. Lady Caldwell, I assure you it won't happen again. I haven't finished, Lady Eleanor interrupted, raising a hand with the authority of someone accustomed to the whole world stopping when she spoke. What you did last night was not simply bringing your son without authorization. What you did was take advantage of my granddaughter's vulnerability. Isabella is a fragile child who is under professional treatment, and you, without any preparation or right, decided to play therapist with a guitar. I never intended. What you intended or did not intend is irrelevant. The results are what matter. And the result is that my granddaughter will now develop an emotional dependency on your son and on you, which will complicate all the work that the true professionals have been doing. Robert clenched his fists at his sides. Every word from his mother burned him inside, but he knew that interrupting Lady Eleanor in the middle of one of her speeches would only make things worse. He needed to wait for the right moment. So these are the new conditions, Lady Eleanor continued, pulling a folded paper from her jacket pocket. First, your son will not set foot in this house again under any circumstances. Second, you will confine yourself exclusively to your cleaning duties, without interacting with Isabella beyond what is strictly necessary. Third, that guitar disappears from this property today. If you accept these conditions, you may keep your employment. If you do not accept them, Penelope has your severance ready. Penelope nodded from her corner, holding up an envelope that indeed contained prepared documents. Everything had been calculated, orchestrated like a military operation designed to leave no escape. Victoria looked up for the first time since the conversation began, and Robert saw something in her eyes that tore him in half. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission. It was the pain of someone being asked to give up the last remnant of the person they loved. Her guitar, the guitar where Samuel's soul lived. Lady Caldwell, Victoria said in a voice that trembled but refused to break entirely. I can accept not bringing my son. I can accept limiting myself to my duties, but that guitar is the only thing I have left of my husband. It's the only thing my son has of his father. I cannot, Mother. Enough. Robert's voice cut through the room like lightning splitting an ancient tree. Everyone turned towards him, Lady Eleanor with surprise, Penelope with alarm, and Victoria with a mix of relief and terror that his intervention might make everything worse. Robert, this is a conversation about household management, and, as I've always told you, this is a conversation about my daughter, Robert interrupted, walking towards the center of the hall with firm steps. Isabella is my daughter, not an administrative project. And what Victoria and Tom achieved in one afternoon is more than any professional has achieved in years, so there will be no new conditions, no severance, and that guitar is not leaving this house. The silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to have a physical form. Lady Eleanor looked at her son with an expression Robert knew too well, that of a woman unaccustomed to losing battles, and with no intention of starting now. You are making a mistake, son, Lady Eleanor said in a low voice, almost a whisper. And when the consequences arrive, I hope you remember this moment. Lady Eleanor withdrew with Penelope close behind, and the hall fell silent. Victoria was visibly trembling, and Robert had to resist the urge to approach and reassure her, aware that any gesture of closeness could undoubtedly be misinterpreted by the eyes that were observing from every corner of that house. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, Victoria whispered. Don't thank me. For what you did for Isabella, I am the one who should be thanking you on my knees. Before he could say anything else, the manor's doorbell rang. It was George Miller, punctual as ever, with a briefcase under his arm and an expression that confirmed what he carried was not simple. Robert received him in his private study. Locking the door, George opened the briefcase and took out a folder, placing it on the desk with the delicacy of someone handling explosive material. Sir, I did a basic search as you requested. Public records, digital archives, press releases. What I found was unexpected. Robert opened the folder. The first pages were digital clippings from newspapers and cultural magazines dating back several years. All of them featured Victoria Harding's name, associated with the Royal Academy of Music, but not as just any student. Victoria Harding was considered one of the most talented guitarists of her generation, George explained as Robert read with increasingly widening eyes. She won 3 national awards before completing her training. She was selected to represent the country at the International Music Festival in Vienna. The press called her the the voice of the strings. She was, according to all experts, an artist destined to change the history of classical music on our continent. And what happened? Robert asked, though he already knew part of the answer, thanks to that morning's conversation in the library. That's where things get complicated, sir, George said, moving to the next section of the folder. Victoria's husband, Samuel Harding, was a luthier, a renowned artisan who made instruments for professional musicians. But what Victoria probably didn't tell you is exactly how he died. Robert stopped reading and looked directly into his assistant's eyes. Samuel Harding worked making instruments in a workshop that operated within an industrial building. That building was owned by a corporate conglomerate that for years ignored warnings about structural problems and safety conditions. One day, part of the workshop roof collapsed. Samuel was the only worker who didn't make it out in time. My God, Robert murmured. But that's not all, sir. Victoria tried to sue the company that owned the building. She hired a solicitor with the few savings she had, but the company had a powerful legal team that crushed the case before it reached trial. Not only did she receive no compensation, but the legal expenses left her utterly ruined. She lost her flat, she lost her savings, she lost everything, and the company never took responsibility. Robert felt each revelation hit his chest harder than the last. But what George said next was what made the ground disappear beneath his feet. Sir, I investigated which company owned that industrial building. The conglomerate that ignored safety warnings, that let Samuel Harding die, and that then legally destroyed his widow to avoid paying a single penny of compensation. George paused, a pause that seemed to last an eternity. The building belonged to Caldwell Holdings, the company your father founded, and that your mother managed during the years you were exclusively dedicated to the hotel business. Robert stood completely still. His brain tried to process the information, but it was as if George's words were written in a language he suddenly couldn't understand. Are you telling me that my family, that my father's company, is responsible for the death of Victoria's husband? I'm telling you that Caldwell Holdings was the owner of the building where Samuel Harding died, and that the legal team that crushed Victoria's lawsuit was hired and directed by one person. Who? Lady Eleanor Caldwell, your mother. The world stopped spinning for Robert in that instant. The walls of his study seemed to close in around him as his mind desperately tried to connect the pieces of a monstrous puzzle. His mother had hired Victoria weeks ago. His mother, who now wanted to dismiss her so urgently. His mother, who had destroyed that woman's life before anyone knew it. Does Victoria know? Robert asked in a strained whisper. Does she know she works in the house of the family that destroyed her life? That's what I couldn't determine, sir. But there's something else. More? George pulled out the last page of the folder. It was a copy of a hospital record. Your wife, Mrs. Caroline Caldwell, before she passed away, was admitted to St. Jude's Hospice. During her last weeks, she received regular visits from a volunteer who kept her company and played the guitar to alleviate her pain. That volunteer signed the visitor's log with her full name. Robert took the sheet with trembling hands and read the name written on the visitor line. Victoria Harding. The sheet slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor as Robert collapsed into his chair, unable to bear the weight of a truth that had just split his life into two irreconcilable halves. Before knowing and after, the woman who cleaned his house had comforted his dying wife. The woman whose life his mother had destroyed had spent the last weeks playing guitar by Caroline's bedside, so she wouldn't die alone, and neither of them had ever known who the other was. Robert didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, George's revelations replayed in his mind like a horror movie he couldn't switch off. His mother had destroyed Victoria's life. His wife Caroline had been comforted by Victoria in her last days, and now that same woman was cleaning the floors of the Caldwell Manor, unaware that she slept under the same roof as the people responsible for her tragedy. Or perhaps she did know. That possibility was what tormented him most. What if Victoria had deliberately sought this job? What if everything was part of a carefully designed plan of revenge? But then Robert remembered Victoria's eyes when she spoke of Samuel in the library. He remembered the tremor in her voice, the way her son looked at her with that mix of admiration and concern. No one could feign that level of pain. No one could fabricate that kind of truth. The next morning, Robert made a decision that filled him with fear, but which he knew was necessary. He was going to talk to Victoria and tell her everything he had discovered. He couldn't keep looking her in the eyes carrying that secret. But before he could find her, something happened that completely changed the course of that day. Isabella woke up humming. Robert was in the hallway when he heard the melody coming from his daughter's room. He stopped with a hand over his heart, paralyzed for the second time in a few days by a sound he thought impossible. He approached the half-open door and saw Isabella, sitting on her bed, wiggling her bare feet while humming the same song Victoria had played on the guitar that first night. "Daddy," Isabella said, noticing him at the door. "Tom is coming today." Robert knelt by his daughter's bed and stroked her hair. "Yes, my love. Tom is coming today. I want him to teach me to dance better. He knows how to spin a lot without falling." Robert smiled with moist eyes. His daughter was planning activities, expressing desires, looking forward to the future things the best specialists had tried to achieve for years, without success. He decided he needed a professional opinion before speaking to Victoria. He called Dr. Alistair Finch, the child therapist who had been treating Isabella since Caroline's loss. Dr. Finch was a man with a calm voice and deep gaze, who had dedicated his life to healing the invisible wounds of children. "What you describe is extraordinary, Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Finch said after hearing everything that had happened. Isabella had built an emotional wall as a defense mechanism against the loss of her mother. No conventional therapeutic technique had managed to penetrate it because that wall was made of the most resistant material that exists, the pain of a child who lost the person she loved most. And how is it possible that a child and a guitar achieved what years of therapy could not? Because children don't analyze pain, Mr. Caldwell. Children simply feel it. And when Isabella found another child carrying the same wound, something happened that in psychology we call emotional recognition. Tom didn't try to cure Isabella. He simply showed her she wasn't alone, and that was enough for her to decide for the first time that it was worth feeling again. "Doctor, I need you to come to the manor. I need you to evaluate Isabella and tell me exactly what we should do to not ruin this progress." "I'll be there this afternoon," Dr. Finch confirmed. But while Robert organized the therapist's visit, in another corner of the manor, something far less noble was brewing. Penelope Shaw had spent the entire night studying the letter she had intercepted from the Royal Academy of Music. The contents of that letter were a bombshell that could destroy Victoria or elevate her, depending on who detonated it and with what intention. The letter informed Victoria that the Academy had initiated a special reincorporation program for talented former students who had abandoned their studies due to extraordinary circumstances. The program included a full scholarship, access to international masters, and the possibility of resuming her musical career exactly where she had left off. The Academy not only remembered Victoria Harding but was actively seeking her out because one of her former professors had launched a campaign to recover the lost talents of her generation. Penelope immediately understood the power of that information. If Victoria received that letter, she would have an opportunity to rebuild her life away from the Caldwell Manor. She would leave, she would take Tom, and Isabella would lose the only connection that had made her smile again. Robert would blame Victoria for abandoning them, and everything would go back to being as before. But Penelope didn't just want Victoria to leave. She wanted her to leave dishonored, humiliated, marked as someone who could never be trusted. Because Penelope had seen how Robert looked at Victoria, and she recognized that look. It was the same look she had been waiting years for Robert to direct at her. So Penelope devised a plan. A plan she presented to Lady Eleanor that same morning, while they had tea in the back garden. "We won't deliver the letter," Penelope explained with the precision of someone who had studied every detail. "But we will use it. We'll make it seem like Victoria was using her position in this house for personal gain, that she intentionally got close to Isabella to win Robert's trust and gain contacts that would allow her to return to the world of music." Lady Eleanor listened with attention, and in her eyes shone something Penelope interpreted as approval. But the truth was that in Lady Eleanor's mind, much more complex and darker calculations were at play. She not only wanted to protect her house from an employee who had crossed boundaries, she needed Victoria to disappear before anyone discovered the connection between Caldwell Holdings and Samuel Harding's death. Because if Robert discovered that truth, not only would she lose her son forever, but the entire family empire would crumble under the weight of a scandal that no lawyer could contain. "Do it," Lady Eleanor said with the coldness of someone signing a sentence. "But make it clean. I don't want scandals." That afternoon, while Dr. Finch evaluated Isabella in the library, Penelope executed the first phase of her plan. She waited for Victoria to be cleaning the west wing of the manor and quietly entered the small room the employee used to store her belongings during the workday. There she found what she was looking for, Samuel's guitar case. Penelope carefully opened the case and placed inside an object that would make Victoria's entire world fall apart. A diamond bracelet that belonged to Lady Eleanor, an antique, family, invaluable piece, the kind of object whose disappearance would provoke an immediate investigation and whose discovery in an employee's belongings would leave no room for doubt. She closed the case, left it exactly as she had found it, and left the room with the same discretion with which she had entered. The bracelet would be reported as missing that very night. The search would inevitably lead to Victoria's belongings, and when they opened that case in front of Robert, there would be no possible explanation to save the guitarist. Meanwhile, in the library, Dr. Finch finished his evaluation of Isabella with results that left Robert speechless. "Your daughter has experienced an emotional breakthrough that I would classify as extraordinary," the doctor said, reviewing his notes with an expression of genuine astonishment. "Not only has she regained the ability to express positive emotions, but she is developing new emotional bonds, something that weeks ago seemed completely impossible. And what do you recommend, doctor? That you change absolutely nothing. Isabella's connection with that child and with Victoria's music is therapeutic on a level that science is just beginning to understand. Interrupting that bond now would be like uprooting a plant that has just sprouted after years of drought." Robert nodded, and at that moment, he decided that neither his mother, nor Penelope, nor anyone in the world would separate Isabella from the people who had managed to give her back her life. But life has a cruel way of testing our determinations at the exact moment we believe ourselves to be strongest. That night, after Victoria finished her workday and prepared to leave with Tom, Lady Eleanor's voice resonated throughout the ground floor of the manor, like an alarm that freezes the blood. "My bracelet, my mother's bracelet, has disappeared." Within minutes, the entire manor mobilized. Lady Eleanor demanded that every room, every corner, every belonging be searched. Penelope directed the search with suspicious efficiency, subtly guiding the staff towards the wing where Victoria kept her things. Robert watched the scene with a bad feeling twisting in his gut. Something didn't fit. His mother had worn that bracelet hundreds of times and had never lost it. Why now of all times? But before he could intervene, one of the staff participating in the search approached Penelope with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss Shaw, we found something in Mrs. Harding's room." The silence that fell over the manor was sepulchral. All eyes turned to Victoria, who stood by the front door with Tom holding her hand, ready to go home. Her face reflected absolute confusion, that of someone who didn't understand why everyone was suddenly looking at her, as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. Penelope walked towards Victoria's room and returned holding the open guitar case. Inside, gleaming under the hall lights like a silent accusation, was Lady Eleanor's diamond bracelet. "No," Victoria whispered, shaking her head as she took a step back. "That's not possible. I never—" "The evidence speaks for itself," Lady Eleanor declared with a coldness that could have frozen the sun. Robert watched the scene, feeling his brain process 1,000 possibilities per second. Samuel's guitar. They had placed the bracelet inside Samuel's guitar. Not in a handbag, not in a drawer, but in the most sacred object Victoria possessed. And that was precisely what made no sense, because no person who hides something stolen puts it in the one place they know they protect with their life. Someone had put that bracelet there, someone who knew exactly what that guitar meant to Victoria, and who had chosen that hiding place on purpose, so that the accusation would be more devastating, more personal, more impossible to refute. And as Robert reached that conclusion, little Tom let go of his mother's hand, took a step forward, and in the trembling but firm voice of a child who had seen too many injustices to remain silent, said something that left everyone present rooted to the spot. "My mummy would never put anything inside that guitar. That guitar is my daddy's. It's the most important thing we have. If someone put that there, it was someone who wants to hurt my mummy. And I know there are people in this house who don't want us here." Tom's eyes, without pointing to anyone specifically, swept the hall with a clarity that shook even Lady Eleanor. And Penelope, for the first time since she had designed her perfect plan, felt something she hadn't anticipated. Fear. Fear of a child who had just spoken the most dangerous truth of all. Not because he had proof, but because he had said it with the unshakable conviction of one who knows his mother's heart better than anyone else in the world. Tom's words hung in the air of the hall like a sentence no one dared to touch. Robert looked at the boy with an admiration that hurt his chest, because that little one had just done what no adult in that manor had had the courage to do, speak the truth without embellishment or calculation. But Lady Eleanor was not a woman to be destabilized by a child's words. "How touching," she said with that icy smile she used when she felt threatened but would never admit it. A child defending his mother. "It's natural, it's understandable, but feelings don't erase evidence. The bracelet was inside your belongings, Mrs. Harding. That's a fact. A fact that someone fabricated," Robert responded, stepping forward, interposing himself between his mother and Victoria like a human shield. "Are you accusing someone in this house of planting false evidence?" Lady Eleanor asked, arching an eyebrow with perfectly feigned incredulity. Who exactly, Robert? Me? Penelope? The staff who have worked here for years with unimpeachable loyalty? I'm saying Victoria didn't put that bracelet there. And how can you be so sure? You've known her for how long? Weeks? I've lived in this house for decades. I've cared for every object, every memory, every piece of this family, and you prefer to believe a stranger over your own mother? Lady Eleanor's words were designed to strike exactly where it hurt most, at family loyalty. And Robert could feel those words finding their mark, because despite everything he knew, despite George's revelations, she was still his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had supported him through the worst moments of his life, who had held this family together when his father died. It was that instant of hesitation that Victoria perceived with the sensitivity of someone who had learned to read silences to survive. "Mr. Caldwell," Victoria said with a voice that had found an unexpected calm amidst the chaos. "You don't need to fight with your mother over me. I know what I did and what I didn't do. My conscience is clear." She bent down, picked up the guitar case with the bracelet still inside, and placed it gently on the hall table. Then she took out Samuel's guitar, the only possession that truly mattered to her in the world, and held it against her chest like someone embracing a living person. "You can keep the bracelet. You can search every corner of my life if you want. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. The only thing I'm taking from this house is what I brought with me, my guitar and my son." "Victoria, wait," Robert said desperately, but she was already walking towards the door. "Mummy, are we not coming back?" Tom asked softly, holding her hand as they walked. Victoria didn't answer. She couldn't, because if she opened her mouth at that moment, she would break completely in front of the very people who had orchestrated her humiliation. And that was something her pride, the only inheritance she had left intact, was unwilling to allow. The days that followed were the darkest the Caldwell Manor had known since Caroline's death. Isabella stopped humming, stopped asking for someone to play with her, stopped coming down to the drawing room where she had once danced with Tom. She locked herself in her room with that silent determination of children who decide the world has already harmed them too much, and that the only way to protect themselves is to disappear from within. Dr. Finch visited the manor several times, and each visit ended with the same devastating diagnosis. "Isabella is regressing, Mr. Caldwell, and she is doing so faster than she progressed. If we don't recover the stimulus that caused her emotional opening, I risk her closing off permanently." "Permanently? What exactly does that mean, Doctor?" "Doctor?" Finch's silence before answering was the most terrifying response Robert had ever received. "It means we could lose her, Mr. Caldwell. Not physically, but emotionally. There is a point in the process of child emotional closure from which there is no return. If Isabella crosses that threshold, no therapy, no stimulus, no intervention will be able to bring her back." Robert left Dr. Finch's study trembling. He needed to find Victoria. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to losing his daughter forever. But the city was vast, and Victoria did not want to be found. Robert hired investigators, checked records, contacted community schools where Tom might have enrolled, visited shelters, inquired in parish halls in the neighborhoods where people went when they had nowhere else to go. Nothing. Victoria Harding had disappeared with the efficiency of someone who already knew what it was like to lose everything and start from scratch. While Robert consumed himself searching for Victoria, something began to change inside the manor. The atmosphere became heavy, as if the very walls knew that an injustice had been committed under their roof and were demanding reparation. The service staff whispered in the corridors. Mrs. Higgins, the cook, stopped preparing Lady Eleanor's favorite dishes without explanation. The gardeners avoided crossing paths with Penelope as if her presence provoked something they couldn't express in words. And it was precisely Mrs. Higgins who one day approached Robert with the caution of someone who knows that what she is about to say could have enormous consequences. "Mr. Robert, forgive me for interfering where I'm not called," the cook said in a low voice, making sure no one else could hear. "But my conscience won't let me sleep. The night the bracelet disappeared, I was in the kitchen preparing the next day's bread. From the kitchen, you can see the hallway that leads to the room where Mrs. Harding kept her things." Robert stopped breathing. That night, long before the scandal erupted, I saw Miss Shaw enter that room. She was inside for several minutes and came out with empty hands. At the time, I didn't give it importance, but after what happened, Sir Victoria didn't put that bracelet there. I tell you, with the certainty of a woman who has seen honesty and lies pass through this kitchen for many years, that girl is innocent. Mrs. Higgins's testimony fell upon Robert like the last piece of a puzzle he already knew, but which needed someone else to confirm. Penelope had planted the bracelet, his mother had authorized it, and between the two of them, they had expelled from that house the only person who had managed to restore life to Isabella. Robert walked directly to his mother's study. He didn't knock. He opened the door wide and found Lady Eleanor sitting at her desk, reviewing documents, as if the world wasn't crumbling around her. "We need to talk, Mother, and this time you're going to tell me the truth." "Robert, I don't know what your Penelope planted the bracelet in Victoria's belongings. I have a witness, and before you try to discredit her, you need to know something else. I know about Caldwell Holdings. I know about the collapsed building. I know what you did to Victoria Harding years before she set foot in this house." Lady Eleanor's face changed as if someone had torn off a mask she had worn for decades. There was no immediate denial, no fabricated indignation. There was something much more disturbing. Silence. A silence that admitted everything without uttering a single word. "And there's something you don't know either, Mother. Something that breaks my heart to have to tell you." "What?" "Victoria was the person who accompanied Caroline in her last days. While you organized funerals and I drowned in my grief, an unknown woman sat by my wife and played the guitar so she wouldn't feel afraid to leave. That woman was Victoria, the same woman whose husband died due to our company's negligence. The same woman you just expelled from our lives as if she were rubbish." Lady Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. For the first time in Robert's life, he saw something in his mother's eyes he never thought possible. Remorse. A remorse so deep and so ancient that it seemed to have been buried under tons of pride, waiting for this exact moment to surface and claim what was hers. "Robert," Lady Eleanor whispered. But her son had already left the study because Robert Caldwell no longer had time for explanations or apologies. His daughter was fading. Victoria was missing, and every second that passed was a second he couldn't get back. That same night, as he reviewed the investigators' reports one last time without finding anything, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Caldwell," said a female voice he didn't recognize. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm the director of the Open Hand Community Shelter. A woman arrived here a few days ago with her young son. She doesn't want to give her real name, but the boy tells everyone his daddy lives inside a guitar. I found your number on a card the boy kept in his pocket. I believe you are the person this child wants to find." Robert grabbed his car keys before the woman finished speaking. Robert drove through the city streets like a man possessed. Traffic lights became blurry, streaks through the windscreen as he repeated Sarah Jenkins' words in his mind. A child who says his daddy lives inside a guitar. Only one child in the whole world said that phrase. Only one. The Open Hand Community Shelter was in an area of the city Robert had never set foot in. The streets became narrower as he drove, the buildings lower, the pavements more cracked. When he finally parked in front of the shelter, he had to remain inside the car for a few seconds, trying to control the trembling in his hands before getting out. The building was a modest construction with walls painted a color that was once cheerful, but which time had turned into a tired shade. A plaque next to the door read, "The Open Hand Community Shelter, because no one should face the night alone." Sarah Jenkins was waiting for him at the entrance. She was a woman with a firm gaze and hands hardened by years of social work, the kind of person who had seen so much suffering that she was no longer surprised by anything, but who also hadn't hardened enough to stop being moved. "Mr. Caldwell, before you come in, I need to explain something," Sarah said in a serene but direct voice. When the woman and child arrived here, she was in a very fragile emotional state. She didn't want to give her real name. She registered as Mary. But the boy, children don't know how to lie when something hurts them. Tom told anyone who would listen that his mummy played the most beautiful guitar in the world and that he missed a girl named Isa. The name of his daughter in that child's mouth made Robert feel a direct blow to the center of his chest. "I found her crying one night in the shelter's courtyard," Sarah continued. "She was sitting on the ground, hugging her guitar, rocking as if the guitar were a baby. I didn't ask her anything. I just sat beside her. After a long while, she said only one sentence. They took the only good thing I had left, and it wasn't even my fault. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but now that I see you here, I think I'm starting to understand." "Can I see her?" Robert asked, his voice choked. "You can, but I warn you, that woman's pride is wounded, and pride wounds are the longest to heal. It won't be easy." Sarah guided him through a narrow corridor to an inner courtyard, where several children played under the gentle hum of spotlights. And there, sitting on a wooden bench against the furthest wall, with Samuel's guitar leaning beside her like a silent companion, was Victoria Harding. Robert stopped several meters away. Victoria's gaze was lost somewhere on the ground, her hands clasped over her knees. She looked thinner than the last time, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and days without enough food. But even so, even in those conditions, there was something in her posture that refused to break, a dignity that seemed made of a material no humiliation could bend. Tom was the first to see him. The boy was playing with other children from the shelter when his eyes met Robert's. He froze for a second, as if his brain needed to confirm that the image was real and not another of those dreams he had every night where he returned to the manor and danced with Isabella. Then, without saying a word, he ran towards his mother and tugged at her sleeve. "Mummy," Tom whispered. "Mummy, look." Victoria looked up, and her eyes met Robert Caldwell's, standing in the courtyard of a community shelter, his suit crumpled, his eyes red-rimmed, and an expression that was half relief, half shame. Victoria's face transformed in a fraction of a second. First it was surprise, then confusion, and finally, something Robert recognized with painful clarity: distrust. The distrust of someone who has been betrayed too many times to believe that anyone comes with good intentions. "What are you doing here?" Victoria asked, standing up with the same upright posture she had maintained the night she left the manor. "I came to find you." "For what? To accuse me of something else? Has a necklace or a ring disappeared now? Do you want to check my guitar again to see if I hid a diamond tiara?" Every word left Victoria's mouth laden with a pain that had fermented during days of uncertainty, of nights sleeping in a shelter, of mornings explaining to her son why they could no longer return to the house where he had a friend. "Victoria." The bracelet was planted. Victoria fell silent, but her expression didn't change. "Penelope Shaw put the bracelet inside your guitar case. I have a witness who saw her enter your room that night. It was all a trap orchestrated to get you out of the house. And why should I believe you?" Victoria replied with a calm that was more devastating than any shout. "Your mother humiliated me in front of the whole house. She treated me like a criminal in front of my son. And you, Mr. Caldwell, you stood there doubting. I saw how your mother's words made you hesitate. I saw that moment in your eyes, that instant when you considered the possibility that I was guilty. And that instant, that single instant of doubt, hurt more than everything else combined." Robert received those words like punches he knew he deserved. Victoria was right. He had hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had allowed his mother's voice to weigh more than what his own eyes had seen, more than what his own heart knew to be true. "You're right," Robert said without trying to defend himself. "I doubted, and I hate myself for it, but I'm here now. And I didn't just come to tell you you're innocent. I came because I need to tell you something I discovered, something you deserve to know, even if it destroys me to say it." Victoria looked at him with narrowed eyes, like someone evaluating whether it was worth opening a door that might hide another betrayal. "What?" Robert took a deep breath. What he was about to say could make Victoria hate him forever. It could destroy any possibility of her returning. But he had learned too late, perhaps, that the truth was the only thing that could heal the wounds that lies had caused. "Your husband, Samuel, the workshop where he worked, the building that collapsed, that building belonged to a company in my family, Caldwell Holdings. My mother managed that company in those years. She was the one who ordered the legal team to block your lawsuit after Samuel's death. The silence that followed was not a normal silence. It was a silence that had weight, texture, temperature, a silence that could be touched and that burned." Victoria took a step back as if Robert's words were a physical force pushing her. Her eyes filled with tears that refused to fall, held back by a will that had learned not to break in public. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands began to tremble in a way that made Tom take her fingers with both his little hands, not understanding what was happening but instinctively knowing his mother needed him. "Are you telling me," Victoria began in a voice that was barely audible, "that Samuel died because of your family, that I lost everything, my career, my home, my entire life, because your mother decided it was cheaper to leave me ruined than to take responsibility, and that after all that, I ended up cleaning the floors of the house of the very people who destroyed my world? Yes. You knew it when you hired me, didn't you? I discovered it later. My mother was the one who hired you, and now I understand that she did so precisely because she didn't want anyone external to recall the case. By having you close, she controlled the situation." Victoria closed her eyes. The tears finally found their way down her cheeks, silent, constant, like a river breaking a dam that had been holding too much for years. "There's something else," Robert said, and his own voice broke as he uttered the next words. "My wife, Caroline, before she passed away, spent her last weeks at St. Jude's Hospice. A volunteer visited her every day and played the guitar to alleviate her pain. That volunteer was you, Victoria. You accompanied my wife in her last days, and neither of you ever knew who the other was. Victoria's eyes snapped open. Her expression changed from pain to disbelief. From disbelief to something that had no name in any language. An emotion so complex and so profound that it seemed to contain centuries of human history in a single instant. "Caroline," Victoria whispered, "the woman in the back room, who asked me to play that lullaby every afternoon because she said it reminded her of her daughter Robert couldn't answer." The tears overwhelmed him, and he collapsed onto the bench where Victoria had been sitting moments before, covering his face with his hands while his body shook with sobs that came from such a deep place they seemed to tear pieces from his soul. "I used to sing to Isabella," Victoria continued, "and now she too cried without restraint. Caroline told me about her daughter every day. She told me she was the sweetest girl in the world, that she had a laugh that could light up any room. She asked me that if one day life put me in front of a sad child, I should play that song, because that song had the power to heal any pain. The song you played for Isabella that night in the drawing room," Robert murmured, looking up. "It was Caroline's song, the song my wife taught me for her daughter, without knowing that one day I would end up playing it for her." Tom looked at his mother and Robert without fully understanding what was happening, but knowing with that sacred intuition of childhood that something very big was breaking and rebuilding at the same time in that shelter courtyard. "Miss Caldwell," Victoria said, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't know who you were when I accepted the job. I never connected the surname. When I saw Isabella sitting alone on those stairs, all I saw was a sad child. I didn't see the daughter of the man whose family destroyed mine. I saw a child who needed exactly the same thing as my son, someone to remind her that life could still be beautiful. And now that you know everything," Robert asked with genuine fear in his voice, "now that you know who we are, what we did, what my mother did to you, can you forgive us?" Victoria looked at her son, who was still holding her fingers with those small hands that didn't understand surnames or companies or legal demands. Then she looked at Samuel's guitar leaning against the wall, waiting in silence as it always did. "Samuel taught me something I never forgot," Victoria said with a firm voice despite the tears. "He told me that music exists to transform pain into something beautiful, that if you get trapped in resentment, the guitar stops playing, and I cannot allow this guitar to stop playing, Mr. Caldwell, because the day it stops playing, I will have lost Samuel forever." Robert understood at that moment that Victoria was not saying she forgave. She was saying something much deeper, that she chose music over hatred, life over revenge, the future over the past, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to honor the man who had put his soul into a guitar. "Victoria, I need to ask you something," Robert said, standing up, "and I need you to know that I'm not asking for myself, I'm asking for Isabella. My daughter is fading again. The doctor says that if she doesn't regain the connection she had with Tom, we could lose her emotionally permanently. Isabella needs Tom and she needs your music, the music." Caroline left her unknowingly. Victoria looked at Tom. The boy who had heard Isabella's name looked up with eyes that lit up like two stars igniting in the middle of the darkest night. "Mummy," Tom said in that voice that could disarm armies, "Isa needs me." And with those 3 words, a child decided the fate of 2 families that life had struck, separated, destroyed, and that now, in the courtyard of a community shelter, had the opportunity to rebuild themselves together with the only material that never runs out, love, that survives everything. The drive back to the manor was the most silent Robert had ever experienced. Victoria was in the back seat with Tom asleep on her lap, exhausted by the emotions of a night that had been too big for his small body. Samuel's guitar occupied the passenger seat as if it were just another passenger, as if it had a right to be there. Victoria had not said she forgave. She had not said she was returning forever. She had only said, "I'm coming for Isabella." And Robert understood that for now, that was enough. It was more than he deserved. When the car stopped in front of the manor, it was almost 2 a.m. The ground floor lights were on, unusual at that hour. Robert got out first and opened the front door, expecting to find the house asleep. But the house was not asleep. In the hall, seated in a chair with a rigid back and hands clasped over her knees, was Lady Eleanor Caldwell. Beside her, standing against the wall with a nervous expression, was Penelope Shaw, and in front of both, with a tablet in hand and a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, was George Miller. "Sir," George said, seeing Robert enter, "your mother asked to speak with you tonight." She insisted on waiting for him. Robert looked at his mother cautiously, but something had changed in Lady Eleanor. She was not the ice woman who gave orders and expected blind obedience. It was something different, something Robert hadn't seen since he was a very young child, and his mother still knew how to cry. Vulnerability. Then, Lady Eleanor saw Victoria enter behind Robert with Tom asleep in her arms and the guitar slung over her shoulder. The two women looked at each other for an instant that contained years of compressed pain in a single glance. Victoria did not lower her eyes. Lady Eleanor did not either, but it was Lady Eleanor who spoke first, and what she said made even George hold his breath. "Mrs. Harding, please sit down." That please left Lady Eleanor's mouth as if she had had to pull each letter from somewhere deep and rusty within her, a place where kind words had been stored for decades unused. Victoria sat down with Tom still asleep against her chest. Robert remained standing beside her, not knowing what to expect. "After my son left tonight," Lady Eleanor began in a low voice, "I was left alone in my study, and for the first time in a long time, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't like what I saw. The silence in the hall was absolute. Not even Penelope dared to breathe loudly. When my husband died and left me in charge of his businesses, I was a woman who knew nothing of the corporate world. I learned quickly because I had no other option. But what I learned was to protect what was ours at any cost. Every decision I made was to keep this family afloat, so Robert would have a future, so the Caldwell name would continue to mean something. And in that process, I became someone who stopped seeing people and started seeing only threats." Lady Eleanor paused. Her eyes were moist, something Robert had not witnessed even at his father's funeral. "When the Caldwell Holdings building collapsed and your husband passed away, Mrs. Harding, a report with your name reached my desk. You were a line in a legal document, a problem to solve, a risk to neutralize. I never stopped to think that behind that name was a woman with a child, with broken dreams, with a guitar that was the only thing she had left of the person she loved. I erased you from my papers and moved on as if nothing had happened." Victoria listened motionless, tears silently falling on Tom's hair. "And when I hired you to work here, I did so because your name appeared on an applicant list, and something inside me, something I didn't want to examine, told me that by having you close, I could ensure the past remained buried. It was an act of cowardice disguised as control." Lady Eleanor slowly stood up with a difficulty that was not physical but emotional, as if the weight of her own words were bending her back. "I will not ask for your forgiveness, because I know there are things that cannot be forgiven with words, but I will do something I should have done a long time ago." She turned to Penelope, who had turned as pale as the marble in the hall. "Penelope, it was you who placed the bracelet in Mrs. Harding's belongings. Mrs. Higgins saw you enter the room that night, and it was you who intercepted a letter from the Royal Academy of Music, addressed to Victoria, a letter she never received because you decided she didn't deserve it." Penelope opened her mouth to defend herself, but Lady Eleanor raised her hand with that authority that this time was not directed at oppression, but at correction. "I don't need explanations. I need you to hand over the letter right now, and tomorrow morning, first thing, collect your belongings. Your time in this house is over." Penelope looked at Robert, seeking some kind of rescue, some intervention that would save her, but Robert's eyes were fixed on his mother, and what they reflected was not triumph or satisfaction. It was something akin to the astonishment of a son who discovers his mother can still surprise him. With trembling hands, Penelope took a crumpled envelope from her jacket and placed it on the hall table. Then, without a word, she walked to the door and disappeared into the night. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. Her exit was as silent as all her manipulations had been. Only this time the silence hid not venom, but defeat. Lady Eleanor took the envelope and handed it to Victoria. "This belongs to you." Victoria took the letter with trembling fingers, opened it slowly, read its contents, and what appeared on her face was something no one in that room would ever forget. Hope. Pure, unexpected hope, as fragile and powerful as the first note from a guitar that had been silent for years. "It's a scholarship," Victoria whispered. "The Academy wants me back. They want me to finish what I started. And you will," Lady Eleanor said with a firmness that surprised everyone. "Caldwell Holdings will fund every expense that scholarship doesn't cover. Accommodation for you and your son, materials, transport, everything, not as charity, but as the debt this family owes you, and that has been unpaid for too long." Robert looked at his mother, and for the first time in years, he felt that the woman who had raised him, the woman who existed before the business world, hardened her, was back, not complete, not perfect, but present. And that was a beginning. Victoria held the letter against her chest as if it were a treasure recovered from the bottom of the ocean. But before she could respond, a sound made everyone in the hall turn their heads towards the stairs, small, bare footsteps, descending step by step with that caution of children who get up at midnight following an instinct they cannot explain. Isabella appeared at the foot of the stairs, her hair disheveled and her eyes narrowed from sleep. But those eyes opened completely when they saw what was in the hall, or more precisely, who was in the hall. "Tom," Isabella whispered. The boy, who had woken with the movement, lifted his head from his mother's lap and looked towards the stairs. "Isa." Tom got down from Victoria's arms and ran towards Isabella. The girl descended the last steps and ran towards him with a speed that belied the emotional lethargy that had consumed her for days. They met in the center of the hall and hugged with that disproportionate strength children's hugs have when they reunite with someone they thought lost. "You left," Isabella said, her voice broken, and that two-word phrase contained all the abandonment that child had accumulated, first with the loss of her mother and then with the disappearance of her only friend. "But I'm back now," Tom replied with that monumental simplicity that was his gift. "And I brought my daddy's guitar so your mummy in heaven can hear us dance again." The song Caroline had taught filled every corner of the Caldwell Manor like a wave that sweeps away everything old and broken and leaves only what is worth keeping. Isabella and Tom danced hand in hand in the center of the hall, exactly as they had done that first night, but this time with witnesses who cried and laughed at the same time. Robert knelt beside his daughter, and she pulled him to dance with them. Lady Eleanor, standing, held by the hand of a child who was teaching her something no business or fortune could have taught her, swayed gently to the rhythm of a melody that healed everything it touched. Weeks later, Victoria returned to the Royal Academy of Music. Her return was news in the country's musical circles, and her former professor, seeing her play Samuel's guitar in the first class, said something that would become legend. "Technique can be taught, but what Victoria has inside is not learned. It is suffered, lived, and transformed into music." Tom enrolled in the same school as Isabella. The two became inseparable, a pair of children who had learned sooner than most adults that shared wounds heal faster than hidden wounds. Lady Eleanor later created a foundation in Samuel Harding's name, dedicated to ensuring safe working conditions for artisans and independent workers. She did not announce it in the press. She sought no recognition. She did it in silence, in the same way she had caused the harm, but this time leaving behind a trace of repair instead of destruction with each action. And Robert, one ordinary afternoon, came home from work and found the same scene that had changed his life forever. Victoria playing the guitar in the drawing room while Isabella and Tom danced barefoot on the rug. But this time he didn't stand paralyzed at the door. This time he entered, sat beside Victoria, and listened to the song his wife had gifted to the world, without knowing that that melody would end up uniting the two families who most needed to find each other. That night, before sleeping, Isabella asked her father, "Daddy, do you think Mummy and Tom's daddy know each other in heaven?" Robert smiled with moist eyes. "I'm sure they do, my love, and I'm sure they're dancing." Isabella closed her eyes with a smile that lit up more than all the lights in that manor combined. And somewhere in the universe, a lullaby continued to play, played by a guitar that contained the soul of a man who kept his promise. As long as those strings vibrated, he would never truly leave. There are instruments made of wood and strings, but there are others, the most valuable, made of love, of loss, of the unshakable decision to transform pain into the most beautiful melody the world has ever heard. And that guitar, Samuel Harding's last guitar, never stopped playing.